Okay, thank you so much for coming to this discussion. So, talking about neuroscientific insights into MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD in the adolescent cohort. I'm going to refer to it as M-assisted therapy because it's just much quicker, but I'll launch right into it. In terms of declarations, none in particular, but this project was carried out as a master's thesis at the University of Amsterdam under the supervision of Dr. Congress Lampe. This is just about me. My name is Jack Kissane. I'm from Galway in the west of Ireland. I just finished a master's in brain and cognitive science. And this year I was very lucky in an internship. I ran an EEG study with psilocybin at the University of Buenos Aires. So just a quick overview on PTSD. We've all heard of it, but how we define it as a disorder can change sometimes, depending on who you ask. But it's a debilitating mental health condition associated with intrusive memories, flashbacks, heightened arousal, and amongst adolescents, about 16% that experience trauma will go on to develop PTSD. And as you can see, interpersonal violence is a big risk factor here, and indeed can sometimes be seen as twice as common in females. Now, that's going to form a big part of our discussion later on as we talk about the biopsychosocial nature of PTSD. And I want to have some fun now and ask you guys some questions. With the first one, so if you don't know, I'll try and explain the questions, but answer in a way that is instinctive. But the first question is, we don't know enough about how MDMA combined with psychotherapy works in the brain. And this is holding back M-assisted therapy in general. So put up your hands if you agree. Okay, interesting. I was expecting more hands, but that's okay. And the non-directive approach described in the MAPS manual of MDMA-assisted therapy may be less suitable for traumatized adolescents than traumatized adults. If you don't know, thank you, but if you don't know, MAPS, they run big clinical trials of M-assisted therapy, and their non-directive approach suggests that the therapist has a bit of flexibility in how exactly they employ the therapy, and it's supposed to empower the patient in a non-directive way. But yeah, hands up if you agree. Okay, a few more hands, that's interesting. And lastly, we aren't doing enough to figure out about why PTSD is more common in females, specifically biologically, in terms of hormonal things, not just societal factors. So hands up if you agree. Okay, even more hands, very nice. Just an overview of unmet need in adolescent PTSD clinically. We have strong therapies, they work very well, like prolonged exposure therapy for adolescents, but they do have a dropout rate, which is sizable, more sizable depending on who you ask, I guess. And up to 50% of adolescents, you can see inadequate responses after treatment completion. And you can imagine that adolescents with PTSD, if they don't receive adequate treatment at a younger age, this can compound as a problem. And it's thought that current therapies could benefit from promoting more psychological safety. So perhaps this is where M-assisted therapy might come into the picture. A little bit about MDMA as a compound, entactogenic, so it promotes empathy and pro-social behavior. It releases serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin, and BDNF. That's brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and it's a neurotrophin. It drives growth and survival, and that's going to be very important later on. But it's thought that the drug and the psychotherapy, they interact in a synergistic way. That's how the fear response is dampened. And the two main mechanisms here, we have fear extinction and memory reconsolidation. Fear extinction is very much linked to BDNF. And in terms of memory, I think that Dr. Kompelzonki later on might speak about this in greater detail, but this is how it's hypothesized to work in the brain. And indeed, M-assisted therapy is projected to be the first regulator-approved therapy where a drug is formally combined with psychotherapy as a single integrated therapeutic package for PTSD, and the first psychedelic assisted therapy of any kind. And if it is indeed approved, which it may well be, and we hope so in many ways, it's a good idea to think now, if the indication is extended to adolescent PTSD, how can we think about what that might look like? An opportunity to be proactive and to look at it interdisciplinarily for the best possible treatment benefits. So I wanted to put two different things together: research, neuroscientific research on adolescent PTSD, and then in adults, M-assisted therapy for PTSD, and see if we can put them together, translate them, looking at things like neuropharmacology, clinical methodology, to think of what would be the best possible scenario for M-assisted therapy in adolescents. And I'm interested in how it works in the brain is different in the adolescent brain. And I want to know if the MAPS protocol, which has phase 3 trials right now, could that be developmentally adapted for adolescents? Is it already very suitable? I'm very interested in costs. and benefits, because I think that healthcare should be, it's all about putting it in people's hands, people that need it. And when we talk about adolescence here, we're considering ages 14 to 19, but the mature minor, 17 to 19, is perhaps what this concept would be most suitable for. But yeah, the biological basis of PTSD. This is some neuroimaging evidence. It's a bit of a busy slide, but the key takeaway message is, for example, in adults, we often see amygdala hyperactivation at rest in adult PTSD. That's, the fear center of the brain. It's a simple way of explaining it. But amongst adolescents, it's not always so consistent. Often it can be delayed, this amygdala hyperactivation. It's described as a window of resilience. But what I want you to take from this is that neuroimaging evidence of adolescent PTSD is less consistent than adults. And even further, in females, it can be even more inconsistent again. So I'm wondering if there's a lens other than neuroimaging that we can learn about PTSD in the adolescent brain. So I'd like to move to some neuroendocrine evidence, speak about hormones and think like this. Regulating stress with the HPA axis, that's hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal, where the external stressor talks to the hypothalamus, to the adrenals. Eventually cortisol is released and it feeds back. But this axis, when it's dysfunctional, highly implicated in PTSD. And the HPA axis regulates, again, it's non-specific. It doesn't just regulate stress, regulates emotions, sexual arousal, and immune function. And again, when traumatic stress is chronic, it can trigger these inflammatory cells, and too much of them is very bad. Now, BDNF, we mentioned, MDMA is associated with this. So we have a link there. And BDNF can help regulate this HPA axis, but it's one of many things that helps to regulate it. And I want to highlight an interesting study in mice, where fear extinction, which we said is a key way that assisted therapy should work in the brain, this was blocked when BDNF signaling was blocked in the mouse brain. Very interesting. We have to be careful. It's maybe something for further research, but not something that we can draw conclusions on in the clinical side. And of course, this effect was region dependent. So we're building a picture here, but we still don't know, but maybe the HPA axis could be important. There was a meta-analysis done of the genes that code for this axis and PTSD severity in adult humans, and there was a big association found at NR3C1. This gene codes for the glucocorticoid receptor, and cortisol binds to this, and cortisol was what fed back and also regulated this HPA axis. So gene expression, if it's altered at NR3C1, and this can happen from traumatic stress, this has been correlated with the strength of traumatic memories. And then a promising pilot study, this time in humans, in adults, looked at DNA methylation, severe PTSD versus placebo, and M-assisted therapy positively affected DNA methylation at this site. And this was correlated with PTSD symptom reduction. It's a nice study. It'd be nice if it was followed up in a bigger cohort. And in fact, a key finding at the bottom, that childhood trauma has been consistently linked to the chronic HPA axis dysfunction more than adults. So at the beginning, we were thinking, could it be adapted for adolescents? But perhaps if adolescent PTSD is more associated with dysfunction and the HPA axis, there could be a specific benefit of M-assisted therapy in the adolescent cohort or whoever experiences childhood trauma. Estrogen, another important molecule, regulates the menstrual cycle. It has been shown to affect fear processing and neural circuitry, particularly one part of the menstrual cycle, the late luteal and early follicular, has been correlated with the exacerbation of PTSD symptoms. Now, lower levels of estrogen are associated with impaired fear extinction, but we found this in fully grown women. Again, there's not enough studies in adolescent traumatized females, which is a real gap in the literature. And in fact, if estradiol is too high in female mouse, it's been found to stabilize fear-based memories, another thing that should perhaps be followed up in humans. So there's no perfect way to measure the biological severity of PTSD. I talked to you about BDNF, HPA axis. These are non-specific targets in a way. So I have a strategy. It's not the most advanced strategy, but it's quite simple and practical and something that you could, in theory, introduce to the lab and the clinic. At the 3 points of this triangle, you'll see cheap, non-invasive, adolescent-friendly biological tests. So at the left, you have hair cortisol concentration. This is a way of measuring, it has been linked to chronic HPA load. It's described as a chronic stress diary. It has some value. At the top, you see heart rate variability, which is obviously implicated in any number of things, but it can tell you about autonomic balance. And skin conductance response measures acute stress reactivity. So if we have no perfect way to biologically assess PTSD, perhaps we could use clever maths and statistics to triangulate a more robust biological marker from these, but they have problems. They have limited biological depth. We spoke about, hormones, and they're not so easy and convenient to measure. And the specificity concerns, these are all, the cheap way of measuring this, because there are alternatives like multi-omic panels where you can measure hormones, and that takes longer and it's more expensive, and it's not something that you could roll out as easily. And then a problem with this triangulation marker approach is if one has poor data, it can affect the others. So these are all considerations when painting the picture of PTSD. Now with this side, with statistical modeling, I want to keep it simple and just think about a statistical model being just putting the pieces together of a puzzle. And in the middle, we have PTSD, and primary and secondary, you see, there were the endpoints of the most recent phase 3 trials of M-assisted therapy. CAPS is a psychosocial scale for measuring PTSD symptoms. You hope that they reduce. And the Sheeran Disability Scale, SDS, again, measures disability from PTSD. And when MAPS ran these trials, they got the results and they fed them into a mixed model, repeated measures, mixed model. And this was, but this is, and they also ran, sorry, and then they also had different endpoints. They measured the Beck inventory for depression because they wanted to see if it had efficacy in depression as well. And they also measured safety data. So they measured blood pressure and body temperature in the participants. Now, this is a biological test, but it wasn't fed into the model of the reduction in PTSD and the reduction in disability. It was just, it was just done to measure adverse events. It was just done as a safety measure in the trial. And they did do post hoc investigations with gender, but again, it wasn't part of the analysis that they were trying to do. And with me trying to maybe model PTSD in a more biopsychosocial way, maybe you could introduce gender into the model, menstrual cycle phase into the model like we discussed, and the new triangulated biomarker to be more biopsychosocial in the way that you model the data. So the clinical side of M-assisted therapy, with the MAPS manual, involves 2 therapists, long sessions, 6 to 8 hours, and it's quite long and expensive, and it involves the drug sessions, overnight stays, things like this. And it's non-directive, empathetic, and supportive. But there are some definitive issues with it because it's quite expensive. It is said that it's about twice as expensive as standard a course of exposure therapy with a clinician, but this is projected. You cannot separate the drug from the therapy. People talk about this, where does the therapy of M-assisted therapy exist on its own? And in the biomedical regulatory process, this is something that the FDA think about. And in the sense that it's non-directive, is it reproducible? Can it be the same thing every time? And the non-directive approach is about unlocking the inner healing capabilities of the patient, but perhaps an adolescent with less life experience is less likely to be able to do this, but I don't know, it's a question and it depends. So I'd like to highlight a different approach, the METEMP protocol. It's a way of putting established exposure therapy together with the compound for PTSD. And it's worth noting that MAPS also had a grant to help support this trial. So it's nice to see different approaches all being supported, and it's shorter. It's 13 hours in total. And MDMA is used in the second session. The most expensive part of M-assisted therapy is the hours you pay for the clinician to be monitoring the patient. And even though you might think condensing is worse, it could be, but it has been reported as non-inferior when compared to exposure therapy, even a year out. And it's highly structured, unambiguous, and could potentially have a stronger therapeutic alliance for an adolescent that might struggle to trust a traumatized adolescent. And the bonus of exposure therapy is it already works. It already works quite well. It already reduces symptoms in adolescent PTSD. So the idea is to put together that biological approach, introducing biological metrics more into the model, and to maybe draw on this METEMP protocol, condensing the therapy, putting less pressure on the adolescent to drive their own therapy, and to come up with this, the SMAP-A, the systematic MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for adolescent PTSD, developmentally adapted, a new type of protocol, or at least to generate some ideas to probe, because there might be another phase 3 trial of M-assisted therapy by MAPS. Can we make it a bit more biopsychosocial instead of just psychosocial? So it promises to be, hopefully, based on some of the points that are given to you today, developmentally tailored to what an adolescent, a traumatized adolescent might need. And it does take into account, if it can model gender and menstrual cycle phase, the hormonal and developmental moderators that might affect PTSD in adolescent females. And the systematic biomarker integration, it's not quite big fancy computational psychiatry, but I think it's important to use cheap, non-invasive biological markers to try and triangulate some type of treatment response. And it promises mechanistic insight where it moves beyond safety vitals, which are important, and of course they should be in the clinical trial, but to think about autonomic balance and the mechanistic underpinnings of PTSD. And I think it's pragmatic because, of course, the clinician-administered PTSD scale is still the main regulatory endpoint, but it should enrich the trial with some secondary mechanistic endpoints. And when I showed you putting together the different pieces of, it's more of a commentary on the regulatory process. It's not like MAPS thinks that the biological data in their trials is not important. It's just they're trying to get it approved because that's their job. And then it's like, well, we can think about the mechanistic things later. But it's nice to think about it all if you can. And potentially, this idea is scalable and feasible. These biomarkers were chosen for low cost, non-invasiveness, because you want the adolescent to be compliant in the therapy. If you want to do a sleep EEG and traumatize adolescents, it might be very difficult for them. So potentially, it's quite realistic to roll this out in multi-site trials. So these are my references. Thank you so much for listening.
Great. Thank you, Jack, for a great presentation. Here's the first question.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. So I'm a psychiatrist by background. The majority of traumatized adolescents I've seen have been traumatized by events that have occurred in their own homes. And I suppose my concerns about adolescents going in for PTSD therapy with psychedelics is that, they come out, they have very little autonomy over their living situation, aren't empowered to change things, and often haven't made the disclosure yet. And I suppose what safeguards would be put in place to protect those adolescents, to screen home situations, because they're so vulnerable and, often at a stage where disclosures about their safety, haven't been made yet.
This is a great question, and I guess it's something that I could have touched on more. And from my readings, the literature, I guess, in some ways was trying to tell me that adolescents, even traumatized adolescents, could be more capable than the credit we give them for. But of course, I defer to you on this. But also, it has been shown, perhaps you can tell me, in certain trauma-focused therapies that the presence of the parent can be beneficial, but it depends on if there's violence in the home. That could be reactive. That could be, again, I think it's a screening process issue where if you're asking me if I think that adolescents should be screened out if they have domestic violence in the home, like, I don't know. And it's difficult. But in seeking, psychological safety for adolescents, I mean, I would like to think that the parent should have a place. And again, it gets even more complicated when we think of what specific age. We're talking about the mature minors in 17 to 19, because I saw lots, like, the younger the brain is, the less predictable it might be to respond to the therapy. So, but in terms of specific safeguards, it's easy to say you can screen out people that you might be that might really respond poorly. But I'd like to say something more sophisticated, but I'm not sure that I can right now. But thank you for the question.
Thank you, Jack. A long question, perhaps. I'll try to keep it short. Last week at a Psykedeelit conference in Sweden, not as good as this one, but okay. There was a lot of discussion about psilocybin MDMA-assisted therapy or psilocybin treatment, right? And there's many people who said that we should now be studying different forms of therapy that we combine and seeing which one is the best and so on. But on the other hand, there was also Guy Goodwin from Compass, who is, as you know, developing psilocybin, trying to get it out there, market it as a drug. And his argument was that we should give the minimum safe program right now and get that approved. And once that's approved, then people can figure out the best ways to use it and develop different forms of therapy. And he said, and I'll be dead then, because he's like 77. But the point is that the important thing now is like to get it approved as fast as we can with the minimum interference, and then later on we can develop all these different therapies. And what do you think? Do we need to do this sort of research now before it gets out there, or is it fine to do it later?
So what this person you're referencing is really talking about, like, that's off-label use. Yeah. This is the thing, like, there's been many reports of, I think, was it Australia that approved off-label use of MDMA? It's a way to sort of get things moving, but here we're talking about literally the most vulnerable people you could possibly talk about, which is why I wanted to make this presentation. Like, obviously I understand that off-label use is how lots of therapies get another indication. But then again, psychedelic assisted therapies and something like M-assisted therapies are pushing the boundaries of like what we thought FDA, biomedical, it's a drug, quite straightforward. And these don't fit that model. I would be very, I mean, off-label use, maybe in the oldest of adolescents. If you're asking me if I'm wary of this, I suppose, yes, I would be wary of it. But it's difficult because I'm often thinking, like, does psychedelic science want the regulatory process to change for them? Or are they going to change for the regulatory process? I have no idea. And I think we're all very interested in this because we're all here. Also, we have careers in this and want to have a future in it. But yeah, that's my 2 cents on that.
I just have a quick comprehension question. Sorry, I'm in my deep squat back here. What's the function of the MDMA in the therapy? Like, does the exposure therapy work better when they take the MDMA in the sessions?
So yeah, the efficacy specific if in the exposure therapy plus MDMA. Yeah. So as you said, like, exposure therapy developmentally adapted for adolescents already works, and METEMP, for more context, that was a small pilot study. They want to follow it up, but they got good results. They got very strong efficacy that would suggest that we spoke at the start about the synergistic effect of MDMA and the therapy, that this really harnessed that, and they had good, strong efficacy, and that it was worth running a follow-up trial with that setup. But it's early, like, that's a study from 2 years ago, and they could use more participants to say if that's a definitive direction they want to go in. But it's worth noting that it's really reliable to see something like the METEMP protocol. I also saw a couple's cognitive behavioral therapy for PTSD with MDMA. So there are other approaches, but with the MAPS manual, as it's designed, it's many, many years along, phase 3. So it has a lot of backing behind it. And if something like METEMP, this has a long way to go, if I understand the clinical trial, as in I'm not sure, it's so many years behind in a way, but it could help us redefine small aspects of the MAPS manual, which is so much further along. So hopefully the knowledge base increases and it's better for the participant and for the patient. That's what I would say.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jack. I have a question regarding like the applicability clinically with these biological markers. I get that they're very important to prove like safety. But do you see any sort of applicability clinically as well?
In terms of like, do you think this is more of a lab thing rather than a clinic thing?
Exactly. So could like these biological markers be used in treatment to optimize the treatment for the individual patient in some certain way?
I think so, because if you think about this triangulated biomarker thing, there could be covariates. So you could plug them into the model and see if there's more precision in the thing you're really interested in, that CAPS, if you can bring that down. And as a moderator, you could see if some people are outliers in terms of their hair cortisol or in their skin conductance response. And you can do further exploratory analyses. And I wanted to pick something that was cheap, interpretable, non-invasive, because it could be used in the clinic and the lab. Because in the lab, you could do something way more expensive and it could take much longer. But then if you do the same thing in the clinic and the lab, maybe you have more data and you can draw more conclusions and maybe you can scale up. So that's what I'd say about that, yeah.
Thank you.
So, first of all, I think you wore the blue shirt with the flowers better than I did. But just wanted to put that out there. This was not coordinated. So coming back to the MDMA in combination with exposure therapy trial, so I'm wondering, because like when you put people under psychedelics, even with MDMA, they also tend to be a lot more vulnerable and very suggestible. And then you have this exposure on the one hand, but on the other hand, so our lab also looked at something like the protective mechanisms involved with MDMA. So it seems to be that you are more ready to face those traumatic memories, you feel more safe, you're not overwhelmed by them as you would be in sober consciousness. So when you put these two against each other, so the heightened state of suggestibility and vulnerability versus this protective effect of MDMA, what do you think, like how do these balance in this form of therapy, and especially for the young adults?
That's interesting. I really wish that they would feel really supported and that they wouldn't have any problems, but I mean, I don't know. I like one thing that I didn't speak about is misconduct in adults in PTSD trials, which is terrible to happen in any age, in any cohort. And that's what makes me think that how much money and time would be actually put into trialing MDMA-assisted psychotherapy in adolescents if there was any thought that something like that would happen. And I suppose in a way, I think that this misconduct happened using a non-directive approach. So if you're talking about how do we get the balance of the good stuff and limit the bad, I was going in the direction of METEMP should be more structured so there's less ambiguity for something to happen where the child is like, oh my God, no, what's happening right now?
Sorry, I was referring more to the, I mean, when you do exposure therapy, you kind of actively and consensually confront a person with stuff that brings up a trauma response in a moderated manner, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I was more referring to that, like if they're able to hold that under the influence better or worse, or is this a dynamic thing for some better, for some worse, and how do we balance that?
It's a good point. And I would maybe take it back to I wish I had something specific to say, but taking it back to the neuroimaging evidence at the beginning, where adult PTSD is more consistently reported on, adolescents less so, and even females can have different effects in the brain. So that's a definitive risk factor. That could definitely be, you could see much more adverse events, I would say maybe, in exposure therapy for adolescent PTSD, for sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
There was just one extra piece I was wondering if you might be able to speak to in terms of neuroplasticity, or I guess what's being referred to now in Gould Dolan's work, the reopening of critical learning windows. I'm wondering if you have your thoughts on that in terms of how people are responding or the opportunity to respond differently to the stimuli that they're exposed to.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, it's a nice question. And if we talk about one of the key molecules was MDMA, I believe BDNF drives neuroplasticity, which isn't always good, but it's just the way that the brain can learn. And if we think about like the critical period of change in the adolescent brain, that if you could promote plasticity and change when and traumatized adolescent, their life trajectory is on a very bad path. If you can provoke that change and something good happens, it's fantastic. If we talk about I did like maybe related, I know plasticity, but in terms of safety in the brain, from my reading, which I didn't really touch on here, at regular doses, I don't believe that MDMA would be would promote much cell death, but of course it depends. I don't want to waffle on this question too much, I'll be honest, but yeah, plasticity, perhaps good. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Jack.